Story 1. I'm a psychiatric nurse. Early in my career, I worked at a residential mental health facility. There was a resident I'll call Marion Duchesne. He was an elective mute, which simply means that he didn't, wouldn't, couldn't talk, but there were no pathological findings as to why. He had spoken earlier in his life and seemed quite normal back then, with the notable exception of being close to 7 feet tall. He'd been raised in the Deep South and joined the military when he was 19. After boot camp, he was stationed somewhere in the South. One night, he just vanished. He was declared AWOL for years, and finally, he was declared missing and dead. 10 years later, a 7-foot-tall man walked into a VA hospital emergency room in my part of the Midwest and said to the receptionist, "My name is Marion Duchesne, and I've been dead for 10 years." Those were the last words he ever spoke. He was covered with dust, and he was wearing the same clothes he'd been reported to be wearing the night he vanished. His social security number had not been used, and he had no identification on his person. However, they were able to identify him, I guess via fingerprints. He was well fed and in good health, except for his refusal to speak. The family was notified, but they said they had already grieved their lost man, and that whoever was claiming to be him simply could not be. They said he was a haint and a stand-in for their dead relative and demanded not to be contacted again. Marion paced all day, every day, not in a frantic way, but just lumbering up and down the halls and outside. He smiled all the time and would be moving his mouth in a way that indicated talking or muttering, but he was dead silent. He had an unnerving habit of throwing his head back with his mouth wide open as if he were laughing heartily, but not even a breath could be heard. If told to go to the dining room for a meal, he'd go and eat. But if nobody told him, he just kept pacing, never indicating hunger. If offered a cigarette, he'd smoke it in an oddly formal way, almost delicately, if that makes sense. But he never seemed to crave smoking. The man wanted nothing. If I talked to him, he appeared to listen, periodically throwing his head back in that laughter-mimicking way of his. There was nothing to do for this man. Various medications were tried, but they did not affect him either positively or negatively. Occupational therapy did nothing because Marion would just grin, and unless told to stay put, he'd get up and start pacing again. On my last day at that job, on my way to something better, the last thing I saw was Marion pacing in the parking lot, throwing his head back to laugh. Later, I wondered if all along I'd been dealing with a ghost. All these years later, I still don't know. Story 2. My auntie used to work as a nurse in a palliative care ward in a hospital. She always used to tell us this story about several strange things that used to happen when she worked night shifts. She worked the night shift with 2 other nurses on the left wing of the ward. The wing was made up of 2 sections with 8 beds in each. They had 8 patients in room 1 that evening. The nurses had looked after one particular gentleman for a while. He didn't often get many visitors as his wife had died years earlier, and he'd lost touch with his daughter, so they quite often kept him company. He always used to ask the nurse to leave a light on by his bed so he could read if he couldn't get to sleep, or for the TV to be left on low. Apparently he liked the voices in the background and it comforted him knowing someone was there. For these reasons, they moved him into empty room 2 when they came into work around 9 p.m. so the noise, light, wouldn't bother the other patients. This became a little routine when the second room was empty. My auntie and the 2 nurses started their shift, as usual, one evening and sadly discovered that the gentleman had passed away earlier that afternoon. Room 2 was now empty again, with the 7 other patients in room 1. It was 11 p.m.-ish, and all the patients were asleep, and the only lights on were those illuminating the office section where the nurses were sat, along with computer monitors and the ceiling lights at the end of the hallway leading to the next wing. They were taking their break, having a coffee, and chatting when one of them suddenly stopped talking and held her hand up. They listened and could hear someone talking nearby. At first, they assumed it was someone from the next wing walking past, but the talking remained a few minutes later. My auntie looked around the corner to see if there was anyone there. No one. She turned back around to go towards the desk and saw a light shimmering in room 2. She called the other nurses, and they went into the room. The bedside light was on, and the TV was on in the bay where the gentleman used to sleep. Auntie said they got the shivers, but it made them feel slightly emotional. However, they switched off the light and TV and went back to the desk. This happened on 7 other occasions over the following weeks, even when other nurses were working. Same light, same TV, always around 11 p.m. What my auntie said was so comforting, as she believed he enjoyed chatting with them and appreciated the extra effort they did to move him so he could watch the TV after hours. So he came back to see them again for their little ritual. The wards later filled up, and room 2 was being used more and more, so was rarely left unoccupied. One patient mentioned a light turning on and waking him up around midnight once, but he couldn't recall which one as he went back to sleep. The legend lives on and is explained to new staff who work there. Everyone on the ward to this day knows of the gentleman who likes to watch TV late at night, and they are told that if the room is empty, to make sure the volume isn't high and to let him watch like he used to. Story 3. A hospital doctor in Colorado. I have 3 stories. 1. Working overnights and getting a page that an old lady with dementia is flipping out. Says someone is in her room watching her around 2 a.m. Got this 3 or 4 times, and we decided to move her to a new room for other staffing issues. Move over an elderly man without cognitive impairment. 1 HR later, boom, same thing. Someone is in the room watching him, and the room is cold. I call bullshit and go check it out. Walk in, and the room is so goddamn cold I can see my breath. Have this eerie feeling something is watching me. Nope out. Move the patient to a new room and leave the room empty all night. Side note, I ran 6 codes over 3 years in that room and never got a single one back. 2. The same hospital has a big burn unit. People flew in from around a 5-state radius. There was a Native American man that had that room for several months. Don't remember how he got burned, but was around 75% body surface area. Keep in mind, every single day they are washing these burns out, going to the surgery every few days to debride. It's horrible and not something I want any part of. Anyways, this guy eventually dies after months of this torture. Shortly after, weird electrical things were in there which I witnessed. Lights off on. The TV is suddenly on at full volume and won't turn off. Phone ringing and static on the other end. The RNs would walk in the room, say his name, and cut it out or stop, and I kid you not, whatever it was would stop. Every single patient in that room for months after talked about seeing a Native American man. It got so bad that the hospital administrators legit called in a Native American shaman from his tribe to cleanse the room, had a ceremony and everything. After that, it never happened again. 3. This one creeps me out the most. Working at a different hospital, and the on-call room is an old repurposed ICU room. The old hospital that expanded and they redid the old rooms. I'm in there asleep in the chair at 5 a.m. The nurses would sometimes pop their heads in the room, so I blocked it with a trash can and Harrison's Principles of Internal Medicine textbook, 5K pages. I'm drifting off to sleep when the door opens and someone walks in. Kinda looks like my partner that is supposed to be relieving me, but 2 HRs early. Strong feeling it's a female for some reason. Anyways, it walks over to where I'm sleeping, leans over, and hisses in my ear the worst goddamn sound I have ever heard. Sounded like an Aztec death whistle. Shit creepy. Didn't know it at the time, but heard it later. I shake myself awake and am freaked out. Figure it's just a night terror, but realize the door is pushed all the way open and the books are holding it open. Never slept in there again. You may not believe me, but these things all happened to me. Hospitals are weird places. Almost everyone that works nights has a hospital ghost story, but they aren't likely to tell you because it makes them seem crazy. Story 4. Growing up, My maternal grandmother and I were always pretty sensitive to paranormal stuff, but my mother was not. She thought her mom was a crock, and she was sure I was making stuff up, just as a preface. So while mom was in nursing school, she worked as a home health aide. She got a pretty cushy gig working with this disabled woman named Mary. I was too young to know what was wrong with Mary, but looking back now, I would guess she was someone who was mentally 5, though she was in her 50s. Mary's parents had provided well for her, left her with her giant, beautiful home, fully equipped for a handicapped person, enough money in a fund to finance care, etc. So mom was one of only 4 staff to work with Mary because she did not like new people. 2 midnighters and 2-day staff. She received around-the-clock care, but mom was able to bring Mary home with her, so we spent a lot of time with Mary as a family. Mary was sweet and very kind. I have an old photo of me, her and mom when I was dressed for one of my dance parades. We all loved her to death. One morning, on a day mom was off work but had school, she got up in a rush and ran downstairs. I thought she was late for school, so I went down with her to help her get what she needed to leave. But she was on the phone, dialing people who were not answering her. I will never forget this. Mom was shaking and crying, blubbering to herself without making any real sense. She finally slammed the phone down on the table and put her hands on her face, and I asked her what was wrong. She told me she had woke up to Mary at her bedside, patting her hand the way she did when she was very pleased with something mom did. But when she sat up in bed, Mary was gone. The phone rang, and it was the nurse at the house. Mary had passed away the night before. She came to tell mom goodbye. She still never believed in the paranormal, but she did quit nursing school and never worked in home health again. She never said, but I got the sense she couldn't handle another Mary happening to her again. My mom was pretty stoic, but that broke her. Story 5. I'm a chaplain who has worked in hospice. Near-death awareness is a known and accepted phenomenon in the hospice community. The dying will begin talking to loved ones who have died, talking about seeing different animals, sometimes old pets, and some even talk about seeing death or an angel of death. The one most interesting to me was a patient I worked with a few months from the time he was in oncology to his decline to death. He was open spiritually but had no religion. We held conversations about many spiritual things, so he was comfortable talking to me as he neared the end. One day he waited for his family and the nurse to leave, and then called me back into his room. He said to me, "I don't want to scare anyone else, and I don't want them to think I'm crazy. I can see death. I can see her out in the parking lot. She isn't ugly. My brother is with her." It should be noted that he had bone cancer located in his pelvis, which eroded it so badly that eventually an artery would burst and they wouldn't be able to stop the bleeding. He was on strong pain medications, but had nothing wrong with his brain and was entirely lucid. He talked about his family and his concerns for them and what he was leaving behind. A few days later, he called me into the room. He told me that death was now in the corner and she was calling him. He confessed he hadn't talked to his brother for years before he died, but he was so happy to see his brother with death calling to him. He asked me to pray for him in my religion, Christianity, because he did not know how to pray before he died. He died that night. I've had numerous other experiences with death awareness, but this one has always stuck out to me. I'm open to interpreting it as the dying psychologically preparing for death. My job is to help them reach the most peace as possible before death. And if this is just psychological, so be it. I know he and others have died well. Story 6. I'm a nurse. I've witnessed quite a lot of Alzheimer's people. They often develop their scenarios in their head, often accompanied by vivid hallucinations. Once during night shift, I heard a woman scream in fear. Checking on her, she managed to climb into her wheelchair in pure panic, wanting to flee her bedroom. Asking what was wrong, she thought the building was on fire. Now, what's important to mention here is that people often make claims that people are just crazy or dreaming badly or something, but this is not the case. People with hallucinations have been found to actually see, hear, smell, etc. something when their hallucinations occur, as the same locations in the brain are stimulated as if they would get real impulses. That woman actually saw fire. She actually smelled fire. She didn't just make that up to be crazy. It's what her brain told her was happening, and she was in a real panic for her life. And the same applies when those people see someone else in their room. When they want me to guide someone out of the bedroom who isn't there, seemingly standing right behind me. And it makes no sense to discuss with them that no one is there. To them, someone is there. And you better do your best effort of improvising to guide that someone, even if it's no one outside. Play along, and they'll be fine. This, to me, is the scariest thing at work. They see something you don't. Story 7. Okay, I am a nurse, but this did not happen to me, but to several other nurses who worked at these units. There is a little girl who haunts the burn unit of a large military medical treatment facility in the U.S. She has been seen by both staff and patients. Haunts may not be the correct term, but she has been witnessed by several. Second, I used to work at the old Walter Reed Army Medical Center. In the old one that moved back in 2011, there was a VIP ward. I believe it was Ward 72. Any retired general officers would stay there, along with any higher-ups in the Government. Think Secretary of State and other cabinet officials. There was also a room for the First Lady and President. This ward is private, locked at all entrances, and very nice. It is furnished with very high-end furniture, and a lot of it was donated by Mrs. Mamie Eisenhower, the wife of President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Well, per my friend who worked there, the ghost of Mamie Eisenhower is very particular about anyone staying in her room. And if anyone did sleep in that room, she would yank off the bed sheets. My friends also said decorative pieces would randomly fall off the table or fly off the walls when they were the only ones up there. Mamie would also apparently page the supervisor, who would call the ward back to a very confused nurse as to who paged them. I floated up there 2-3 times during my time. My friend was on with me and told me all of this. I didn't believe her, so I went and sat in the room where Mamie would mess with people. I fell asleep, but sadly, nothing happened that night. Story 8. Oh shit, I got one. In med school, we had an anatomy exam on like Nov 1st or 2nd. So on Halloween night, I and my roommate decided that since everyone else was off partying, this would be a good time to get some uninterrupted studying going. Well, it was already creepy as hell being in the basement of the med school surrounded by cadavers. Well, an hour or so in, we're going through anatomy, and all of a sudden, on the other side of the lab, a faucet suddenly turns on. These faucets are the ones that have motion sensors on them, and we're on the other side of the lab. We were a bit creeped out, but dismissed it. We get back to work, and then it happens again, but on a different side of the room. Again, far from where we are. This happens maybe 2 more times, over an hour or so. Finally, we've had enough, and we decide to leave. As we're gathering our stuff and heading out, we remark to each other about a side room where the instructors will prep their lectures for exams, etc. We decide to pop our head in to see what was in there, and we stop dead in our tracks. As I said, we were the only ones in the lab, and we had heard no one else come in. In the side room, there is some person that we don't recognize bent over, working on a cadaver. Their back is to the door, and I and my friend were being plenty loud, yet they remain hunched over working on the dead body. We have no idea who this strange person is, and we've had it now. We slowly back out and get the fuck out of there. Story 9. I am a psychiatrist, and during my training years, I worked for 6 months at a ward treating patients with depressive and anxiety disorders. It was an old building that had been housing psychiatric patients since the mid-1920s. On our floor, we had 13 beds and a nursing station, a living room, and a few conference rooms. One day, a few weeks in, I am interviewing a patient who, when asked about sleeping patterns, tells me she has heard a baby crying at night, waking her up. There are no babies in that hospital as the place is situated far away from housing areas, and there were restricted visiting hours. Afterward, the nurse pulls me aside and tells me that the baby crying thing is not a psychotic symptom. She is very serious about this, but won't elaborate. I kind of shrug it off, as either way it does not change the diagnosis or treatment, and forget about the experience. Around 3 months into my stay, I sit in the nurse's station, and 3 nurses behind me are talking. One of them says, "She is very active today," and the other says, "Really? Oh, hadn't noticed." I turn around and ask them who they are talking about. They look at each other, and then one of them hesitantly says, "Well, there is a baby here. She cries sometimes." I, of course, say no, but they just kind of shrug and smile. Not 30 seconds later, I heard it. It sounded far away, but not too far. A cry. Clearly a baby's cry, sounding like it is separated from us by maybe 2 or 3 walls. I am perplexed and look at the nurses. They look at me like, "Told you so." I, of course, ask about this, but they can't say anything else but this faint baby cry is there and has been there always. Since then, I heard it maybe 2-3 times a week. I told a new doctor about it who laughed, however. A few weeks into her stay, she came to me, white as a sheet, and told me she heard it in their coffee break. All the nurses just kind of knew about it, and being in psychiatry, hearing that kind of stuff is not something you brag about. I was transferred and haven't heard it since. I think about it sometimes, but I don't know what to make of it.
Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.